The soft hum of the airplane engines created a steady background rhythm, a quiet symphony that filled the expansive cabin of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. First-class passengers had already settled into their plush seats, some flipping through glossy magazines, others adjusting their seat belts or scrolling aimlessly through in-flight entertainment options. Overhead bins clicked shut, flight attendants bustled down the aisles, and a general sense of routine filled the air. No one on board had any idea that something unforgettable was about to unfold, something that would leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. In a luxurious first-class section, an elderly black couple sat comfortably near the front. Their calm and elegant demeanor added an air of sophistication to the cabin. Leonard and Evelyn Thompson, both in their late 70s, exuded a quiet dignity. Leonard, with his salt-and-pepper beard meticulously groomed, adjusted his reading glasses and skimmed through the morning newspaper, his fingers steady despite the slight tremor that age had gifted him. Beside him, Evelyn delicately folded a silk scarf on her lap, the deep burgundy color complementing her elegant cream blouse. Her pearl earrings caught the soft cabin lights as she smiled gently at her husband. It was a routine flight, New York to San Francisco, a trip they had taken many times before. But today, something was different. The moment of peace was interrupted when a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the soft murmur of the cabin. "Excuse me, I need to see your tickets," a flight attendant demanded. The voice belonged to Heather Monroe, a flight attendant in her mid-30s, dressed impeccably in her neatly pressed uniform. Her blonde hair was tied into a tight bun, and her name tag gleamed against her dark blazer. Her expression was stern, her stance rigid, as if she had mentally prepared for confrontation. Leonard looked up from his newspaper, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, but he quickly composed himself. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and handed over 2 boarding passes with a calm, practiced hand. Heather barely glanced at the tickets before shaking her head firmly. "These seats are reserved for paying passengers," she declared, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Conversations around them faltered. A businessman working on his laptop paused mid-typing, his eyebrows knitting together as he listened. A young mother instinctively pulled her toddler closer, sensing the tension crackling in the air. Evelyn remained composed, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on her scarf. Her voice was soft, yet carried a weight that demanded respect. "We paid for these seats," she replied, her gaze unwavering. But Heather wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind. With a small, knowing smile, Heather turned slightly and raised her hand, subtly signaling for security. What she didn't know, what no one on that plane knew, was that Leonard and Evelyn Thompson weren't just passengers. They owned the airline. And what happened next? No one on that flight was prepared for it. Heather's demand had turned heads, but what followed sent ripples of discomfort throughout the cabin. Leonard handed over the tickets without hesitation, his demeanor calm but watchful. He had seen this kind of quiet questioning before, the way people sometimes hesitated when they looked at him, unsure, doubtful. It wasn't new, but it was always disheartening. Heather barely scanned the boarding passes again, her lips pursed tightly. "I'm going to need you to step aside while I verify this at the front desk," she said flatly. Evelyn inhaled deeply, exhaling through her nose before speaking. Her voice remained calm, but there was a hard edge beneath it. "You have our tickets right there. What exactly needs to be verified?" Passengers were now openly staring. Some tried to act as though they weren't watching, peeking over the tops of newspapers or pretending to be absorbed in their phones. Others, less subtle, simply gawked, waiting for the drama to unfold. A businessman near the aisle shifted uncomfortably, tapping his fingers against the armrest, while the young mother bounced her restless toddler on her knee, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. Heather didn't answer. Her jaw tensed as she spun on her heel and marched toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain that separated first class from the galley. Evelyn sighed softly. "Here we go again," she murmured, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle in her skirt. Leonard reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Let's see how far she takes it, he said, his voice low and even. At the front of the plane, Heather grabbed the intercom and called for backup. Moments later, David Clarkson, the senior flight attendant, emerged from the galley, his brow furrowed as Heather explained the situation. "There's a couple in first class who don't belong there," she whispered. David blinked, clearly unsettled by her wording. "Did you check the manifest?" Heather straightened her spine. "I didn't need to. It's obvious." David's jaw tightened. He'd worked with Heather before. She was efficient, but there was something about her decisiveness that often bordered on arrogance. "You should always check," David warned quietly. But Heather ignored him. Instead, she reached for the intercom again, calling for airport security. Minutes later, Officer Mark Grayson boarded the plane, his security badge clipped to his navy blazer. He moved with a deliberate authority, his heavy boots clicking on the metal threshold as he stepped into the cabin. His appearance immediately heightened the tension. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. The businessman closed his laptop. The mother clutched her toddler tighter. Mark approached Leonard and Evelyn, his posture polite but firm. "Sir, ma'am, I need you to come with me so we can clear up this seating issue." Leonard adjusted his glasses, his gaze calm but piercing. "A seating issue," he echoed, gesturing toward their boarding passes still clutched in Heather's hand. "Our tickets are right there." Mark hesitated. He'd dealt with difficult passengers before, people who refused to comply or caused disturbances, but this didn't feel like that. There was no shouting, no aggression, only calm defiance. Evelyn spoke next, her voice cool but laced with indignation. "We're elderly, officer. You're asking us to stand up, gather our belongings, and walk to the front of the plane, all because she refuses to believe we belong here." Mark glanced at Heather, who stood stiffly beside him, her arms crossed and her jaw clenched. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. Leonard folded his newspaper neatly and placed it aside. "We're not moving," he said flatly. Heather bristled. "Then I'll have to insist. And I'll have to refuse." Evelyn shot back, her chin lifting slightly. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, clearly torn. He had a job to do, but something about this wasn't adding up. Leonard's calmness, Evelyn's grace, they didn't fit the profile of disruptive passengers. Leonard leaned in slightly. "Son, before you make a decision you'll regret, I suggest you call your supervisor." Heather scoffed. "This is ridiculous." But Mark hesitated. Something in Leonard's voice made him pause. Reluctantly, he reached for his radio. "This is Officer Grayson requesting clearance to remove 2 first-class passengers. Can I get verification on their status?" Static crackled, followed by a pause that seemed to stretch endlessly. Then a response came through. "Do not remove those passengers. Repeat, do not remove them under any circumstances. We're sending someone to handle this." Mark's head snapped up. Heather's arms dropped to her sides. "What do you mean, do not remove them?" she demanded, panic threading her voice. Mark didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to Leonard and Evelyn, suddenly studying them with fresh eyes. Leonard met his gaze calmly. Evelyn smoothed her scarf again, her expression unreadable. Moments later, the curtain at the front of the plane shifted, and a tall man in a navy blue suit stepped into the cabin. His presence was commanding. Passengers sat up straighter, the cabin falling into a charged silence. It was Richard Bennett, the airline's regional director. He strode down the aisle, his polished shoes silent on the plush carpet, until he stopped beside Officer Grayson. When his eyes landed on Leonard and Evelyn, his carefully controlled expression slipped, just for a moment. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Thompson," he greeted, his voice laced with respect and unmistakable worry. Heather's heart stopped. He knows them. Leonard sat back in his seat, folding his hands together. "Richard," he said smoothly, "you tell me. Your flight attendant here seems to believe my wife and I don't belong in these seats." Richard's jaw tightened. He turned slowly to Heather, who now looked as if she might faint. "Ms. Monroe," he said evenly, "explain to me why you assumed these passengers didn't belong here." Heather's throat worked as she struggled for an answer, but there was none. I thought I was following protocol," she stammered weakly. Richard's voice hardened. And what exactly made you think Mr. and Mrs. Thompson didn't belong here? She had nothing. The truth was simple and damning. She hadn't checked. She had assumed. And she had assumed wrong. Richard's face was a mask of control, but his voice cut through the cabin like a knife. "These two passengers aren't just paying customers," he announced, turning to the stunned audience of first-class travelers. "They own this airline." A stunned silence swept through the cabin. Passengers blinked in disbelief. The businessman lowered his laptop. The mother stopped bouncing her toddler. All eyes were now on Heather. Her face drained of color. Leonard leaned back, not smug, not angry, just deeply, deeply disappointed. Evelyn adjusted her scarf. "Such a shame," she murmured. "All these years of service, and you still don't know who signs your paycheck." Heather didn't speak. She couldn't. Richard straightened. "MS. Monroe, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. A supervisor will meet you upon landing to discuss further disciplinary action." Heather's heart raced. "Wait, I was just—" Richard cut her off with a sharp hand gesture. "Enough." Mark gently took her arm, guiding her away from the Thompsons, away from the judgmental eyes of the passengers. Her once commanding presence now felt hollow, stripped away. She had been so sure of herself just moments ago. Now, she had nothing, and she was only beginning to realize how much she was about to lose.